All right, very good evening to everyone this evening. It is great to be back here on a Sunday night. We're going to be studying Is Revelation for Real? We are going to be in Revelation chapter 12. And yes, good evening, good evening. I see so many logging on now, so good to have you with us. Good to be back here. We are rather excited because we had a wonderful day of worship today. It was absolutely wonderful to be able to gather together with the assembly of the saints and to sing out. And we know that many of you wish you could have been here as well. And so we send out our love, and we will anxiously wait for you to come. Once again, we are studying Is Revelation for Real? Still waiting just for a second here to be able to get the live stream going on both the YouTube as well as our website and the Boxcast TV. So give me just 1 second. I see a whole bunch checking in. I love it. This is wonderful to see so many of you. So glad to have you here. Go to Revelation chapter 12. That's where we're going to be studying tonight. There is a lot to look at. We are in a new section. This is Revelation chapter 12 through 14. I'm going to go ahead and put up this.
All right, very good evening.
All right, I'm getting the sound now.
It is great to be back here on
Let me get this
Sunday
muted.
night.
It always makes me happy to know that technology is working. So this is the outline that we've been working with. And so if you go to the sermon notes website, there's a link for that on our Margaret Street website. If you go to the sermon notes website, I have an updated outline there. So what I'm going to do each week, or as we progress, I'm going to keep updating that so that you can continue to follow along. I'm going to add some more fields to that as well so you can take other notes. But be sure and check that out, and you can follow along or get your Bibles out and get ready to make notes in your Bibles or get a notepad or something, because as I mentioned, there is a lot to go over. All right, it looks like everything's working well. We've got several that have joined in. Good evening to everyone. Thank you for letting me know that you're here. I appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Revelation chapter 12. So as we see here in this outline of Revelation, we've been breaking this down into different sections. We looked at the 7 candlesticks. I'll just go ahead and scroll through these real quick. We looked at the 7 candlesticks, which we studied and determined were the 7 churches of Asia, and how there are lessons in there for each and every one of the congregations that even exist today. We then progressed into the 7 seals of judgment, and we talked about what those seals are as he broke open those seals, and they each had certain things that they represented. I'm going to show you how all this ties together here in just a moment. And then we looked at the 7 trumpets in our previous study, all the way from chapter 8 up to chapter 11. So now we're going to get into yet another one, and that is what's called the 7 symbolic figures. Let's see if I can get to this next one. The 7 symbolic figures is the next section of the outline. Once again, the number 7. 7 things we're going to see in here, but even those 7 things you can divide into 3 different sections, and you'll see that. Actually, 3 different chapters in this case. Chapter 12, you'll see there, is titled The Great War. That's kind of a little preview of what we're going to be talking about. And then we will talk about chapter 13 of Satan's allies. And then finally we'll get into chapter 14. We'll talk about the Lamb and the harvest. Now there's so much going on in this section, and so much that you need to understand. It's impossible to be able to cover all of chapters 12 through 14 in this time that we're studying. So I'm just going to focus on chapter 12. And so what I want to do is I want to take a few minutes, and I'm going to explain how all this ties together. And then first we'll read the passage. And then I'll explain how all this ties together. And then we'll break down the various verses and all the different symbolism that we see here. And so I hope that this is going to help you in your own study. So let's read the passage. I'm going to be using my computer here to read this because it helps me to be able to move real fast between the different passages. So let's start in Revelation chapter 12, and we're going to read the entire passage. I want you to pay attention to the wording. I want you to go ahead and let your imagination open up and see what is right there. Let your imagination see what was revealed to us through the Apostle John, through that angel that came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. All right, so let's read. Now a great sign appeared in heaven. Reading the New King James Version. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child, who was to rule all nations with the rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. A war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth. His angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and a half, from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have testimony of Jesus Christ. So, as I mentioned, there's a whole lot going on just right here in chapter 12. Chapter 12, quite frankly, is one of my favorite chapters of Revelation, because there is so much going on and so much imagery, and it's so rich. You've heard us say many times in this study, and I want to remind you again, this book is a book of encouragement. And so remember that whenever you're reading this, because you think, how am I supposed to be encouraged by dragons and all the different wars and things that are going on? But there's a lot that you will see, hopefully we'll explain, that you should be encouraged. And so that's what we're going to look at. This, chapters 1 through 11, okay, it points to a victory. We've seen that over and over, that there's this victory that's going to happen. But it also painted and showed that there's going to be a lot of problems and trials and persecutions and things like that. And perhaps a child of God is wondering and asking the question, well, why? Why does there have to be persecution if God is so powerful, if all this is happening? Well, what we're about to see here, or what we are seeing now in chapter 12, is the reason why. And most commentators, and pretty much anybody who studies this, realizes that this is a major division in the book. So you've seen me break down this into 7 different groups. And as you see there in the outline we have posted here, that even this, beginning in chapter 12, is a whole different section of the book. It's the vision changes, if you will, to some degree, the way he talks about it. Really what we're going to see is that every single time the vision just gets more intense and more intensified. And so it's a very interesting development, very interesting way of literature that's written. And so I hope that helps you see there's a lot going on here. Now, one of the things to help us understand what's going on is to look at the way, speaking of literature, the way this is written. You might remember that I put this, keep pushing the wrong button, here we go. You might remember I put this picture up. Remember when we talked about the trumpets and those angels and stuff? Well, if we use this to show the chronology of Revelation, how Revelation is written, how it's laid out, what it represents, then what you see is we're going to use this clock, and we talked about in chapters 1 through 3 those 7 candlesticks. So we started at the time that Jesus came the first time, his first advent, and then go all the way around to the day of judgment. That's what that time represents. Those 7 churches represent all churches for the entire Christian dispensation. So then we got to the next chapters, which was those 7 seals. And we again looked at from the time of Jesus' first coming to the time of Jesus' second coming. And in those, you might remember, but the 6th seal was judgment. So we see that going from the time Jesus came the first time until the day of judgment. We did it again in our last study whenever we were studying the 7 trumpets. We simply just backed up and we went back to Jesus the first time he came, and we traversed the same ground again all the way up to judgment. You might remember once again that final trumpet, the 6th trumpet, showed that judgment. So this right here, the way that this is laid out, is really key to be able to understand Revelation, because there's so many people that look at it in completely different ways, and it confuses people. Let me show you what I mean. I brought this, so let me put this in real quick. Like I said, we're now backing up. We're going back to the beginning. We're going to traverse that ground again. But here's why people get confused, because they want to make everything go in a linear line, like what's written right here. You see those 7 seals, and then they want to say that the 7th seal is what those 7 trumpets in. Those 7 trumpets come out of that. Or perhaps they'll take these and they'll put them up in a linear line, one right after the other. You have the 7 seals, and then you have the 7 trumpets, and then right after that, now we're into these 7 symbolic figures, as if it's one long line. So as if all of those go, as you see there, right about there, the cross, Jesus' first coming, down here to the day of judgment. Just line them all up. That's how people see this. If you remember in the last study, I showed you that's not how this works. Remember that clock we just looked at, how you keep traversing the same ground. Well, what we're doing right here with this is showing you how those line up. The first 6, remember the 6th seal was judgment. So if the 6th seal is judgment and the 6th trumpet was judgment, how could you have more than one judgment day? You see, that's where things start to get confusing. But if you look at it this way, then you begin to understand he's telling the same story, just in a different way, a different segment, a different, the whole thing has to do with the first time Jesus came until his second coming. And let's tell it to you in different ways. For example, the 7 seals, it introduces that justice will be served. God will render justice. The 7 trumpets announce, as in what a trumpet does, announces that justice. And you're going to see in the next section, after we go past these 7 symbolic figures, we're going to have another symbolic thing, as in a seal or a trumpet, and that's going to be those bowls. And you're going to see 7 bowls. That's justice rendered. So it's talking about justice in 3 different ways. So once again, we're going to back up, and we're going to go back to from the time of Jesus' first coming until the judgment day. And really, we're even going to go further than that. You remember that I had those pictures to show you the 7 seals that we had, and then I showed you there was also a picture of the 7 trumpets that people have painted to represent all that. Well, just like this, there is a picture or pictures out there of these symbols, these 7 figures that we're going to deal with three of them, right there, three we're going to deal with today in this study in chapter 12, and then the other four we're going to deal with in subsequent studies. Now, one more thing to remind you before we get into breaking down what all these things mean is to remind you what we have studied in regards to the seals and how all this is tied together. And so you remember there's those 7 seals. And the thing I want you to see in this is I want you to notice a pattern. So you see on this right here, you see we have those 6 seals. Well, first we have 4 seals, which were those 4 horsemen. Then you have those seals 5 and 6, which in this case was the martyrs, and then there's the judgment. And then you have that interlude. You remember that? Where we stopped for a little bit and we talked about the kingdom and stuff like that and how it was delivered up to God. And then that 7th seal was silence. Hopefully you remember that. If not, go back and look at that video and it'll explain it. Then you have the 7 trumpets. Notice the pattern. Once again, the first 4 were specific. They were a third, not final, and it was destruction by natural forces. Then you have 2 seals, 5 and 6, which was destruction by Satan. And then notice the pattern continues. There's an interlude, and then you have the 7th trumpet. So I want you to see stuff like that because that helps explain what's going on here. And one of the things that's going on is it's a literary device. It's one of the ways that John can write, the way that the vision was delivered to him, to be able to write these incredible things that he saw so that we humans can understand this heavenly vision, and it's written out in patterns. God is a God of patterns. If you don't know that, you need to call me, text me, come sit down and study with me, and I'll show you that God is indeed a God of patterns. And so we see this even in the Revelation. So, now let's get into chapter 12 and let's break down these verses and see what's going on here so we can understand. To set up the picture for you to be able to grasp what's all being said here that we've already read, I want you to think of it this way. Have you ever seen 2 animals fight to the death? You think about what you may be watching well, I'm going to date myself here. Was it Omaha, Nebraska, or one of those Mutual Omaha? That was it. Mutual Omaha's Wild something. I remember when I was a kid, my granddad used to love that show where he'd show all this stuff over in Africa and things like that. Well, you would see, for example, a tiger or a lion or a cheetah or something chase down a gazelle or something like that. And you see them fighting, and what you see is that gazelle is fighting for its life, and it will thrash about, and what you're seeing there is a death struggle. And when you're in a death struggle situation as an animal, you're going to do anything you can to save yourself or to lash out, anything else. So think of it that way, because that's exactly what we see right here. We see Satan in a death struggle. Thank you. That's a Wild Kingdom. That was the name of it. It is a death struggle. That's what we're seeing here with Satan. Satan hates God. He hates the church. He hates anything to do with God, and his time is limited. We've already seen that several times. And now he knows his time is limited. The passage said that. So he's in this death struggle. And so that's why this horrible force, which is known as Satan, is wreaking the havoc that he is upon this. Now, let's take a look at what we see, and let's look at the individual characters and see what we can learn. First thing we see is a great sign appeared in heaven. Now, this is the first time that John uses the word here, this word sign, is in the Greek, semeion, which is sometimes translated as miracle. It's sometimes translated as supernatural or wonder. What it means is it signifies something. It's something special. This is not just a normal thing to see. And so it's a sign that appeared in heaven. And he sees a woman. It's also the first time we see a woman mentioned in Revelation. And this woman is very special. She's clothed. And listen to her. I want you to try to get the imagery in your head. And you kind of see there in the picture, this woman is clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. So lots of different things going on there. That word garland, by the way, in the New King James, let me do a comparison here and see if what the ESV says. The ESV says a crown. The New American Standard is what a lot of people use also. It also says crown. That's a better rendition of this, or translation, because this is that word Stephanos. Remember, we've talked about this a few times in the past. It's a victor's crown. Think about that crown that's put on the winner of a race in the Olympics or something like that. And this symbolizes what Jesus said to us in Revelation chapter 10. Remain faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. And so this is that victor's crown that is on her head. Now, she's clothed with the sun, and on her head that crown of 12 stars. The number 12 typically indicates religion. Usually that's what you're going to see, is that number 12 representing religion. In fact, a good reference here is James chapter 1. James 1, verse 1. Listen to what it says. This is interesting. James, a bondservant of God and to the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Now, he's writing to Christians, and he says the 12 tribes. Christianity is not divided up into 12 tribes, so why does he say that? Well, he's using it as a reference of religion. He is Jewish, and he was once, he still is really, when he writes this, part of those 12 tribes of the Jewish economy, the Jewish religious system. And so there's an interchange here that takes place a lot of times. We're called God's people. Well, so was Israel. We're called the spiritual Israel. There's all kinds of interchanging between the old kingdom, or the old economy, the old religious system that was Judaism, and Christianity. That is key to understanding who this woman is. Because this woman, what she represents is the whole family of God. There's lots of ways of saying this. She is the church. She is the assembly. She is the congregation. She is all the saints from the Old Testament, all the saints in the New Testament. She represents the people of God. And the thing about it is, with her being clothed with the sun and all that beauty, the point is that her true beauty is not really recognized by those of the world. Worldly people cannot see the beauty of this celestial creature. And you think about that people don't understand religion. They don't understand spiritual things. They don't understand that how beautiful it's going to be whenever Christ delivers up his kingdom to God. And so here she's beautiful. Now, this is, this is a representation of God's people. And the way we know that, the family of God, is because you're going to see this transition. Right now, think about, where did the Messiah come from? Because you see the very next thing that it talks about is that it says, then being with child. All right, so don't think that this is Mary. This is not Mary, the mother of Jesus. This is spiritual. Okay, and so in this case, where did the child come from? Well, it came from Israel. And as we read, and as you're going to see towards the end of this, that then transitions into being, it says, her and her descendants. Well, we're descendants. As Paul says, we're of the seed of Abraham. We're not actually Jews, but because of that spiritual seed, we're all part of God's people. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, send me a comment or a private message or something, and I'll give you some more on that. That one comment we have right here is that she is the kingdom of God. That's a great way of describing that in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Reference here, make a note of this, Micah chapter 4, verse 10. That's a great reference on that. All right, so it says that she, being with child, she cried out with labor and pain. Now, stop and think about that a second. Again, this is not Mary, the mother of Jesus. This is that spiritual Israel, and I want you to stop and think about all the pain and misery that Israel went through in order to produce the Messiah. You think about it being carried off into captivity. You think about the time of the judges. You think about all the things, how much God had to deal with his people in order to bring forth the Messiah. Now, God's plans were not going to be foiled, but he had a lot. There was a lot of struggle, a lot of pain that was involved. So it's out of faithful Israel that the Messiah would come, and later on she's going to wind up representing, this woman's going to wind up representing the church. I want you to also make a note of this, because we're going to see this in the subsequent chapters, is that she is a stark contrast to another woman that we're going to see that's one of these seven figures, and that's, I'm going to tell you right now, is the harlot of Babylon. Now, it's complete stark figure. So I want you to notice another thing that's going to stand out in this section, chapter 12 through 14, is all the contrast. There's lots of contrast, and we will emphasize those more next week as we continue the study. Now, so what do we have so far? We have a woman, all right? Then we have a child. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the child again for just a second, because it says there in verse 5 that she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Now, it does not take a rocket scientist or a master theologian to figure out now who this child is. I gave you a lot of information about the woman because studied this and understood it, and you might be thinking, well, how does he know that? The only way I know that is because the Bible tells us. You remember one of the things that we told you about in studying Revelation is you need to know your Bible. You need to know the whole Bible to fully understand Revelation. But here, the Bible clearly tells us who this child is. This child is going to rule all kingdoms, it says. It says that he will rule with a rod of iron. Now, that does not mean that he's heavy-handed or bad. It means iron you don't break or bend. In other words, it's solid. He's going to rule, and it's going to be no bending, no flexibility. It's going to be exactly what it's supposed to be. Then it goes on to say that he was caught up to God. Well, there's no other person that's caught up to God and his throne other than Jesus. Now, stop for just a second and think about what we've already read in the book of Revelation. Go back to the first century. Remember, that's another thing that we tell you about Revelation all the time. Go back to the first century and pretend you are a Christian receiving this letter for the first time. We've already read about the throne, remember, in Revelation chapter 4 and 5, and we read about the lambs right there by the throne. And if you're a Christian, you know these things because you've already read the letters of the book of Acts. You've read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's letters. You've read all of Paul's great letters and stuff like that if you're part of the church. So you understand these things. Again, you need to know your Bible if you want to know and understand Revelation. So we know that this is Jesus and that he was caught up. And what that means is that he was protected by God. Yes, Jesus was killed. He was killed, but he rose again. He had that power, and he ascended up to heaven as a victor, and that's what we're supposed to take heart. Remember, I said this is a book of encouragement. We take heart knowing that Jesus is caught up by God and is at that throne right now. All right, so we have a woman. We have this child, and we're going to talk about that more in just a second. But then we have this incredible character, this figure, this symbolic figure. Another sign appeared in heaven, says verse 3, behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. Man, that sounds terrible. And you see the picture that we have here and just how horrible that thing looks. And you stop and think about it. You know, every society, or maybe you don't know this, but every society has in its culture a dragon of some sort. Depending on the society, sometimes it's an actual literal dragon. These serpents that what do they call them, monikers and monitors that look like dragons, and they have other names for them. And this literature and mythology and things like that in all cultures understand this word dragon, and so it conjures up right away this imagery that's powerful and something terrible. But notice all the things that it says, and don't get too worried about this imagery, because the Bible tells us who this is. Remember, we read in verse 9, this is Satan, that old serpent. We'll talk about that more in just a second. But here you see this dragon, this symbol, and you look at all the different things. First of all, it's red. Now, what does red remind you of? Well, blood. If there's anybody that's caused a lot of bloodshed, it would be Satan. And so there's that imagery there. He has these crowns on his head. Now, that's a minute ago I was telling you about, remember the word Stephanos, because that's the victor's crown. Well, this crown that the dragon is wearing is diadem. That's the type of crown that's a ruler, somebody who is like an emperor or something like that. And then he has these 7 heads. All right, so he has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, these heads meaning vitality, meaning leadership, and there's 7 of them. There's all kinds of different things that we're going to see. For example, later on in this section, we're going to see the 7 hills. Well, that represents the 7 hills of Rome that Rome was founded on. And there's other references that we'll cover later when we get to that, as far as what that means with having the 7 heads. And then the 10 crowns that he has. Again, just this power that he has, or 10 horns. When you think of horns, think of an animal with a horn, like a bull. And what does that do? That's showing power, that's showing strength and danger as well. And so you remember that. Now, stop and think about all that imagery. Now, God could have just simply said, there's a struggle going on between good and bad, Christ and the church and Satan. And while that's 100% true what we see, it doesn't really implant in your brain as much as this kind of imagery. When you think about Satan, and when you truly think about how terrible he is, isn't it a better description to describe him as a dragon? A fiery red dragon with multiple heads and all the ugliness that goes along with it. See, that's the purpose of this. It's kind of like a song. We remember songs a lot easier sometimes than if we were to memorize a whole passage of something. We can remember a song. Well, that's kind of the way Revelation is. All this imagery to help you remember this stuff, so that then you can encourage others, you can teach others the gospel, and you can explain to others what's going on, why all this is happening. All right, so we have this dragon. And in verse 4 it says, his tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. All right, there's a couple of things going on here. We're going to see that a little bit down in the verse, in the passage, when we get into the war with Michael. But this third, it says, now we're not told exactly what that is, but it says he took 1/3 with him. Well, think about it. Is Satan alone? Is Satan the only evil thing that we have on earth? If you stop and think about what Jesus did while he was here on his ministry on earth, what did he do? He cast out demons. So we have not just Satan, but we have Satan and his demons, his allies. And that section, that part right there, is what we're going to see in the next chapter, these allies. And when we get to that, we'll explain that more, and it'll develop more, and you'll see that it's not just Satan that we're having to fight. He's the head, if you will, of all this. That's why he has these crowns. That's why he has those horns. But he's not the only one. And so, it says he stood before the woman, prepared to devour the child. Now, there's a connection here between, I want to go ahead and jump down real quick to verse 7. It says, a war broke out in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought the dragon. Notice it doesn't say that Christ and his angels fought the dragon. It says Michael. That coincides perfectly with what's going on here with the dragon standing before the woman ready to devour her child as the moment she gives birth to it. Because Satan has been trying to disrupt God's plans, to destroy anything God does, and destroy the Messiah before he was ever born. Stop and think about the history of the Old Testament. How did Satan try to destroy God's plans? Well, you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Then after the Garden of Eden, you wind up all the way, use Pharaoh. Pharaoh was one of his tools or devices or weapons, if you will, struggling to try to thwart God's plans. You move forward in history and you wind up with people like Jeroboam, who divided the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Israel, and then set up false teaching and false idols and false religion. And then you continue on in time and you wind up with people like Jezebel. You wind up with people like Herod. Herod tried to kill the baby. Before it was ever, remember that story of Herod trying to kill the babies 2 years and under? And so imagine that. That's the dragon. That's Satan sitting there ready to devour the child. It even goes all the way up into where this time when they're reading with Nero and Diocletian and all those who are torturing and murdering the Christians. You see, Satan is always right there ready to devour the child. However, that's why you read in verse 5 that he was caught up to God. God was not going to be defeated. God is all-powerful. He's almighty. He's those words that we use, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. See, that's something Satan is not. And we're going to see that even more in just a second. Satan is not that by any means. And so we have this incredible scene in front of us of this dragon who is there to devour the child. Now, look what happens when all that is unfolding. So she bore the child who was caught up, and then look what happens. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So the woman, remember I said how this transitions from Israel into the church. Now, think about what God did for his people when he delivered them. He delivered them into where? The Israelites, the Hebrews. He delivered them into the wilderness. And so here is using that familiar terminology that after the Messiah came and then returned to God, we, his body, the children of God, the family of God, are still here, and we are now in what would be called the wilderness. And that wilderness, what did God do for Israel? He provided for his people. He fed them. He protected them. He watched over them. And then you see that number. Here we go with we're going to see more and more numbers as we move through the book of Revelation. 1,260 days. Now, before you get too worried about that, just back up and look in chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 3. And you're going to see that same number. Remember when we talked about the two witnesses? In Revelation 11:3 it says, "And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth." And now here we are in chapter 12, and he's using that same number again. Remember what I said about patterns earlier? Well, this is showing that pattern, and what it's showing is those two witnesses are going to testify for an indefinite amount of time. It is a shortened time, but it's not forever. It is a specific time, but it's not specified what it is. And so this is that time between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. Those witnesses are going to be testifying. And now here, God's going to protect the church during that time too. So This term, 1,260 days, is a very controversial term in a lot of theology over Revelation because people want to use it to count and say that it represents this, it represents that. Listen, what have we seen here? We've seen the church and Israel described as a woman. We've seen the child. Now, that's an accurate description because Jesus was at one time a child. And then we see Satan described as a dragon. What are we dealing with here? We're dealing with symbolism. And so don't take a number out of the middle of symbolism and all of a sudden turn it into something literal and try to calculate a date. This is simply symbolism. It's symbolism that means the Christian dispensation, the time from Jesus' first coming until his second coming. It's also the same thing as we're going to see later on in Revelation, the 1,000 years. It's the Christian dispensation. And so just like there's different names for the church, there's the body, there's the people of God, the family of God. Well, there's different ways of saying time, and that is this 1,260 days, 1,000 years, or whatever it is, the time frame that God wants to use to show symbolism. Now we move on into this next verse, and this is a key verse. You need to circle this verse, highlight it, put a star beside it, or whatever you want to do to emphasize it, because this verse right here is really what the entire book of Revelation is all about. This is really what we're dealing with, and this is the explanation. Here's the why. Here's why we have problems. Here's where all of this is coming from. This is what we're having to deal with. This is the main point, and that is war broke out in heaven. There is a spiritual battle. There's a spiritual war that is going on, that is in another realm, that is in the spiritual realm, that is outside of what we can see physically, but it's there and it's here now with us. And so it says that Michael and his angels fought the dragon. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that this lines up perfectly, that it's not Christ. Now, what this does is it shows that this battle has been going on since the dawn of time. It's been going on since before Jesus came to the earth. Because you think about it, what was the first thing where did this begin? It began before Jesus came to the earth the first time. It began in the Garden of Eden. And that's what we see there in verse 9. So you have this battle with Michael and the dragon and his angels. All right, so remember what I said earlier about a third that was taken out? There you go, his angels. We don't know how many. It doesn't tell us, but we know there's a lot. That he has these demons, his own angels, his allies that were fighting with him. I want you to imagine in that beautiful scenery that we saw in chapter 4 and 5, here's this angel who is creating problems and winds up fighting another angel, Michael. Now, Michael is called an archangel in other places. He's the only one who receives a name like that. And he's God's representative, or one of God's weapons, if you will, against this other angel or this other being that was in heaven, Satan. And they wind up in this fight. And so verse 9 shows us exactly who this is. That great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old. See, that's referencing back to the garden, called the devil and Satan. Now I want you to see there's 4 names that was used for Satan right there. He's called a dragon, he's called a serpent, he's called the devil, and he's called Satan. And here he is cast out, and he deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, him and his angels with him. And so this is marking that before Jesus came, at the beginning of time, as we see in the garden, Satan was already there. This battle had already taken place, and is still taking place. There's still this battle. He's still fighting God in every aspect that he can, and so he was thrown to the earth. Now, there's so many different things about him Because first of all, his defeat is absolute. He knows he's defeated. And stop and think about that. Who has the power? Let me see if I can say this a different way. If somebody is capable of casting you out from somewhere, that indicates that they have the power. Think about military terms. If some power goes in, is able to cast out somebody, that's power. And that shows you that who has the real power? God. God is omnipotent. God is all powerful. He's almighty. And so he has the power, and Satan knows that he has messed up. He knows that his time is limited, and he needs to understand, or he knows that his days are numbered, that he is going to be put away. All right. So what we see is, and we're going to get to verse 10 in just a second on that with the great comments. So be sure and read the comments on here. We got some great comments that are coming through here. So this Satan, let's talk about him for just a second and make sure we get the full picture of who he is and why this is going on. You remember that he's described by Jesus as the father of lies. All right. And then also he's called an adversary. He's called an adversary in 1 Peter 5, verse 8. He's also called the prince of the world. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4. And he's the wicked one in Matthew 13, 19, and 38. The other thing I want you to notice here is whenever it says that he was cast out, you know, the original Greek that is written, that this book was written in, is very specific in its time frames, the way that it says stuff. And the particular time tense that it uses means a once and for all, that there's no continuation or anything. It's happened, it's done, and there ain't no going back. And so he was cast out, and the point of all of this is to reveal the supernatural causes behind all the opposition that the church is faced with, or that sees, or whenever it occurs. It should be no surprise to a Christian to know that it's because of Satan. Remember what I said, this is a book of encouragement. And so behind every problem that the church has, here's why. Because of this battle that is raging. And he's like a spoiled child, if you will, who is just doing everything he can to create havoc. And so it says that he's thrown out, and very important description that is given of him, as is pointed out just a second ago in verse 10. Listen, it says, "Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, 'Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of Christ have come.'" See, that's why Satan is upset. That's why he is angry. Because when Jesus comes, Jesus not only rose from the dead, but when he did that, he says, as is written in John, that he was cast out of the world even. And so the one weapon, one tool that Satan had at his disposal was death. And Jesus took that away from him. And so he's even more angry. So now we have, as it says in verse 10, that we have salvation, the strength, okay, the strength of the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ has come for the accuser of our brethren. Now, when you see the word brethren, we talked about that woman. That woman represents the old Israel as well as the new spiritual Israel. And so even those are our brethren. And notice he's called an accuser. Remember I said, look at contrast. You have an accuser who sits there, and that's what he does. Think about, remember Job, the story of Job, where Satan was walking around and he was trying to accuse Job of telling God that Job will blaspheme him, that he'll curse him if you let him at him. And so he's accusing, and he's constantly accusing us. He's standing there accusing it, wanting God to use his wrath on us. And so he's an accuser. But what does 1 John chapter 2 verse 1 say? It says we have an advocate. So here we may have an accuser on one side, but we got Jesus, an advocate, on the other side. An advocate means one who comes to our side, to our aid. Listen to the rest of the words. So we have for the accuser and our brethren who accused them before our God day and night has been cast down, and they overcame him. How? How were they able to do it? By the blood of the Lamb. This is going back to chapter 5 now in Revelation. Remember that Lamb. The blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. That word testimony again is the word martyria, which is where we get our word martyr. All right, so martyrdom. Now I want you to stop and think about that a second. Whenever someone chooses, and notice I like the way that it says, the word of their testimony, their martyrdom, and they did not love their lives to the death. You see, every time a Christian chooses to suffer, even die, instead of being disloyal to God, it's a defeat of Satan, and it makes him angry. And so that's why this is important. Now, I want you to think about everything that's being said when it says in verse 12, with them having the blood of Christ, they have the word of their testimony. They chose martyrdom instead of bowing down to Satan. And it says, therefore, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down for you, having great wrath, because he knows his time is short. So like I said, he's like this spoiled brat who's just knocking stuff over, doing everything he can as you're sending him to his room, and he's trying to just make as much havoc as he can, but yet the people, the heavens rejoice. You remember in chapter 6, that fifth seal, were those martyrs, those souls underneath the altar. You remember what they said? How long, Lord? How long until you avenge our death? And here you see, God hears. God knows. That also ties in perfectly and harmonizes perfectly with chapters 2 and 3. Whenever Jesus, walking through those candlesticks that represent the church, and each time he says, I know your works. Remember what I said about this is a book of encouragement? When you're reading this and you see, wow, all this stuff is going on, and it's Satan causing all this, but it gives you encouragement to know that A, God knows. He knows what's going on. God is the power. Satan's time is limited. Yes, he might kill you, but that's not the worst thing that can happen to you. You see, those who are saved, those who have the blood of Christ to save them, they have eternity in heaven with God. Satan knows his time is limited, and he has a doom coming to him, that lake of fire. We're going to see that when we get to chapter 20 at the end of all of this. He knows it. He knows where he's going. He knows what's in store for him. And so he's going to do everything he can to create problems for the church. Read the rest of it. And so it says now that when the dragon saw that he had been cast to earth, remember he's got a short time. He doesn't have a lot of time. His time is limited. His power is limited. Everything about Satan is limited. That doesn't mean he's not dangerous. Doesn't mean he's not capable of causing problems, but he's limited. And he had been cast. He persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. See, now we're transitioning into the church. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, and she was nourished for a time and a half a time. That's the same thing as that 1,260 years. The 2 wings, that's a reference back to Exodus, whenever God said that he was going to give Israel wings like eagles. And all that means is deliverance. He's going to protect them, help them escape. And that's what he's done for the church. And then notice it says the serpent spewed out water to carry away the woman with the flood. Go back to the Garden of Eden. What's the first thing that Satan did? What's the first act of terrorism? First act of terror, the first act against God that he did? A lie. He told Eve, you won't die. And so the first thing was he used his mouth. And that has continued. That's why he's called the father of lies. And what happened? He carried Eve away in the stream. There's some beautiful imagery there when it says But you think about the church. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, and the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. You see, God's going to protect, and He sometimes will use nature even to help the church. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 16, verse 18. He says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church," and listen to the words, "and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." See, God's going to protect the church. God's always going to be there. It doesn't matter how much Satan spews out. It doesn't matter how much Satan does. God's going to protect the church. And so the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Who's that? Us. We're the ones who keep the commandments of God. We're the ones who have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Remember what I said, how the woman transitions into the church, and so these are her offspring. And so now we understand why we have so much problems with persecution, why there's so much going on in problems with the church and things like that, because there's a spiritual battle that's taking place. Such an important lesson, and so much we can learn. Well, I just barely got all that out in just under an hour. That's a lot of information. I hope this has helped you. Go ahead and add this one last one in here. So now what we've seen in these 7 symbolic figures is this first chapter. Next week we will pick up chapter 13. We might make it through 13 and 14, but there's a lot of information there too. But the first thing you need to understand, and I think hopefully now this makes sense right here, is that there's a great war going on. And of these 7 symbolic figures we're going to see, the first one is this woman, which represents the church. Then you have the child, which is Jesus Christ. And then you have the dragon, which is Satan. So now that we've explained these things and laid it out so that hopefully it makes a little more sense, go back and read the passage again. Go back and read even from the beginning of Revelation. And let me know what you think. Because I find encouragement in this, and I always enjoy reading Revelation because I know that my God is all-powerful, almighty. He sent His Son to save us, and Satan's going to be defeated. I just have to remain faithful. I have to keep my focus and faith on God. That's what this letter is all about. I hope this has helped you. I hope it's been encouraging for you, and I hope you'll join me next week at 6 o'clock here, same place. And we're going to continue studying. Is Revelation for real? It is for real. And we'll pick up with chapter 13 next week. Thank you so much for joining me, and God bless.